The life of a fisherman, it never gets old. So welcome to the show, come on yo, we're going Ike.
Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli here. Want to talk to you about the recent Going Ike episode, Central Park Bassing. First of all, let me say, bassing in urban areas, bassing in cities, in little ponds, rivers, and streams can be amazing. It's an underutilized opportunity. Everybody lives in a city. Go find some water around you. There are fish there. But I want to talk to you about the bait, the technique we used to catch bass in Central Park in New York City. It's pretty amazing. And we actually ran into a tough day where the fish were really tight to cover and they were lethargic. And we used a small compact jig to get some really nice bites in Central Park. The bait that we used was Missile Jigs. It's a 3/8 ounce compact style jig. We used a black and blue color, and it was really key in that watercolor. I'm going to show you what I do to this thing out of the pack. I'm going to show you the trailer I put on and how I modify it, and then I'll talk about the technique. The great thing about the Missile Jigs is this thing out of the pack is pretty much ready to fish, but I make a couple small modifications. You know, the first one, if you look at the weed guard, depending on the cover, I like to thin it out just a little bit. And what I do is, on the length of that weed guard, I like to get the tip of the weed guard about even with the point of the hook. So you could just line it up with your thumbnail, and then I'll go ahead and trim a little bit of that length off. The next thing I'm going to do is I spread my weed guard out a little bit, and I just like to grab about 20 or 30% of that weed guard, just a small amount, and I'm actually going to trim that back. Especially in moderate to sparse cover, this is a great little modification to get more fish in the boat. The next thing on this jig is the trailer. Trailer is real important. I like crawl trailers. I like a double tail grub trailer, but this is one of my favorites. And it's a bait by Berkeley Havoc. It's called a Devil Spear, but because this is a smaller compact jig, I use the smaller size Devil Spear. And I do two things when I'm fishing it as a jig trailer. The first thing I do is I cut down a little length, and I'm going to cut down about a ½ inch off the tip of that bait. I just cut that straight off. The next thing I do is the tail, and especially when I'm trying to imitate a crawfish, I like to split that tail down the middle. And I'll actually just get my scissors, I'll line it up with the spear of that tail, and I cut down to the last rib. And that makes two separate forks. And they both still move, but it looks a lot like a crawfish. And then finally, I'm just going to thread that trailer on there. And if you look at the Missile Jig, we have a 360-degree subtle trailer keeper. It's really nice. And I just thread that thing on there flat. Not sideways, but flat. And just pull it up, make sure it's nice and straight. And there's that compact jig that's so awesome in tough fishing conditions. It's got the thinner skirt, frog hair skirt, weight forward design, comes in and out of cover, really awesome. Let me talk to you now about the technique that Joe Sancho and I used to trigger the bites. And when you think about fishing a jig, you really think about fishing it fast. Flipping in there, hopping it real fast, reel back in, flipping again. And when they're active, that's a great technique. But for lethargic fish, we use the technique called soaking a jig. And quite simply what that means is letting a jig get into the cover and leaving it there. Really letting it sit for a long period of time. My rule of thumb is 10 seconds. And I'm gonna let that jig fall into the cover and let it sit for 10 seconds before I move it. And the neat thing about a jig, and if you'd see this thing in the water or in an aquarium, especially the Missile Jig with the fine skirt, it's constantly moving and pulsing with the water. And so even though you're not moving it, that jig is breathing. And that's a key technique when it's tough. And so my typical cast, just to kind of show you what it looks like, is I'm going to throw it into that cover. And at Central Park, it was brush, logs, pieces of bushes that had fallen in the water. I'm going to throw it into the cover. I'm going to let it fall on a semi-slack line. Boom. When it hits the bottom, I'm not going to move my rod for 10 seconds. I'm actually going to count. And I like to keep my rod at about 2 o'clock position and wait for that bite. When I count to 10, if that fish doesn't bite, all I'm going to do is a real small twitch with my rod. I'm going to twitch it, just real subtle. Just once or twice. And I'm going to let it sit again for 10 seconds. And I'll do that 2 or 3 times. I'll reel it in. And I'm going to make another pitch to that same piece of cover. The key to soaking a jig is to slow down, leave it in the cover, and let that skirt pulse for you. Real quick on the rod, the reel, and the line. For line, I'm a big believer in fluorocarbon, and we used 15 and 17 pound fluorocarbon that day. On the rod, I like a 7 to 7.5 foot medium heavy action casting rod. The rod that I used was an Ike series rod in a 7.2 length. And finally is the reel, and I'm a big fan of the Abu Garcia Revo MGX. It's got a 7:9 to 1 ratio, super fast ratio, lets you set the hook, get them out of the cover, really key. Let me tell you 2 things. If you have a lake or a river in a city where you live, go fish it. There's bass in there. Number 2, if it's a tough day and they're in the cover, try a technique called soaking a jig. Try the compact jig, and you're going to get some bites. Mike Iaconelli talking about Going Ike, Central Park, episode 1.
When I fish like him, you know I'm fishing hard. You might wanna say that I'm